On this day, the 29th of November 1807, the court of Portugal leaves Lisbon for Rio de Janeiro. The royal family Braganza, the King of Portugal, the Queen, and all the retainers, 420 in total, the government, the ministers, as well as the treasure of the royal vaults, left Lisbon on this day. They had gone aboard on the 27th, but because of storms were unable to leave. French forces were bearing down on Lisbon, and they had made the decision that if they wanted to keep their thrones in the long run, they needed to leave, and leave quickly. The Royal Navy escorted the royal party from Lisbon as far as Madeira. Most of the British fleet returned after that to European ports. A few, about half dozen British ships, continued on with the royal party until they got to the Brazilian coast. Eventually, 15,000 Portuguese people who had been displaced because of war and occupation would end up at the court in Rio. The journey took a little while. Obviously, this wasn't modern day travel. And it was in January when they arrived in Brazil. They set foot first on a northern Brazil, Salvador. And there, the king, he wasn't officially in charge yet, he was more the regent. But he was the one in charge. He opened up the ports of Brazil to old friendly nations, which meant Britain. Obviously, that was in appreciation for them helping the family out of Europe and protecting their kingdom in Europe. They would spend 13 years in exile. Rio de Janeiro became the royal capital of the Portuguese Empire. Brazil itself would be upgraded from a colony or a collection of colonies to a kingdom itself. A new title for Portugal would be formed, and that was the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, plural. We obviously know that there's an Algarve in the south of Portugal. Algarves referred to all the other territories outside of Portugal proper, the Algarve being the last part of Portugal that they had conquered from the Moors. So this would refer to Madeira, Cape Verde Islands, territories in Africa, Timor, Macau, and all the other territories that they held at this point. The Algarves were all of their colonies, outposts, and trading ports. So this new United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, this was quite an upgrade from colony. Once there, Brazil became much more vibrant than it had been. It had been just a plantation in reality. But because the royal family were there, because the government was there, because most of the important people in Portugal were there, suddenly they wanted things like palaces. They wanted sewers, schools, universities, academies, botanical gardens, the opera house, parks. Suddenly all of these things were being built and commissioned, and Rio was becoming an impressive city. It was being cosmopolitanized, whereas once it had been a backwater. When in Brazil, 145 new noble titles were handed out. Lands were granted. Dukes, counts, barons suddenly were all over Brazil. Brazil was in many ways now the main center of Portugal and Portuguese power. Now the effects on Brazil itself was that this, in a roundabout way, led to its independence in 1822. And Brazilian independence was very different from the independence that the Spanish colonies took. The Spanish colonies became republics. They drove out the old order. The landowners who were living in places like Colombia and Mexico and Argentina seized power from what they called the Peninsulares, the Spanish who had come over and been appointed as the governors and leaders of the New World. Also, the Spanish colonies fell to pieces. Wars, civil wars, chaos, undemarked borders. No one really knew where a border was or which country existed from day to day for quite a few decades. Whereas Brazil, it became independent with the son of the Portuguese king becoming its first emperor. So in many ways it was much more stable. It was more of a transfer of power rather than a revolution. While the court was in Rio, great strides and progress were made in this former colony, now kingdom. They started encouraging manufacturing, industrialization. They wanted trade, open trade with many countries, friendly countries. They also started building roads between the settlements which had been once cut off from each other. And when it was a colony, that suited the Portuguese. They didn't really want people in Brazil coming together and realizing that they had another identity other than Portuguese. So a settlement up in Salvador was the only way to get to Rio from Salvador was to get a boat. Sao Paulo, you could just about get to the coast of Santos, the port there, but then you have to get a boat to get to Rio or Salvador. Porto Alegre, again, you'd have to get a boat to all the different places. San Luis, up in the north, up in Natal, all these different cities along the coast. They were isolated from each other, and in many ways it was almost as easy to get to Lisbon as it was to get to another port in Brazil. Connecting them up by building roads and infrastructure gave Brazil an identity. And so when eventually the king had to return to Lisbon to deal with the crisis there, he left a country that was united, that had the prestige of being its own kingdom, and was not any more subservient to Portugal. It was its equal now. It had its landed aristocracy, it had its senate, it had its House of Lords or whatever you want to call it. It had its own parliament, it had its own courts, it had the royal court. It was no longer a backwater. Now, what happened in Portugal is interesting. So once Napoleon had been thrown out and the war had ended eventually, the British had occupied Portugal for about 10 years. Portuguese royal family didn't bother coming back. Bit odd. Maybe they preferred being in Brazil. So, eventually, the British started leaving because the war was over, no need to be here anymore. And once they had left, a constitutional crisis began. The king and the royal family went back and tried to sort out the problems in Portugal. This led to reformation there. They had to give in to various liberal demands, and that's what happened in Portugal. But he left his son, Pedro, his heir as well. Pedro had lived in Brazil since he was 9 years old, grown up in Brazil. He thought himself obviously as Portuguese, but he was also Brazilian. And so when the court in Lisbon was talking about demoting Brazil back to a colony instead of a kingdom, he didn't like that, and most of the lords in Rio didn't like that. And so Pedro became the first emperor of Brazil. And Brazil charted a very different course from their Spanish neighbours at this point. And the monarchy lasted almost 60 years. More than 60 years. So, this is what happened on the 29th of November 1807. The Portuguese royal family, along with their retainers and the government, leaves Lisbon for Rio. If you like these videos, come back for more tomorrow. Comment, like, and subscribe.